You're watching a production of South Dakota Public Broadcasting.
Welcome to Contours, conversations about issues in agriculture that impact us all. Contours is produced by the South Dakota State University College of Agriculture and Biological Sciences and SDSU Extension. These programs are distributed online through igrow.org.
Hello and welcome to the second edition of Contours as we continue our open conversation with South Dakota agricultural leaders and you. I'm Dr. Barry Dunn, Dean of the College of Agriculture and Biological Sciences here at SDSU. This is the second Contours program where we'll continue to explore some of the issues of concern for livestock development in South Dakota. As we talked about in the first program, there is an increasing amount of discussion about livestock development in the state. They include issues of regulation, infrastructure, academia, communication, culture, economics, and of course, the environment. A few of the observations that came out of a recent Livestock Development Summit will help us focus our discussion today. The group found that livestock development projects in some counties meet local resistance, and many times the greatest resistance is from other farmers. Some of that resistance centers around environmental concerns, including the challenges of air quality issues, odor, water quality, and applying manure without negatively impacting soil health. Back with us today to continue the discussion are four people who are involved in livestock development in South Dakota. Paul Kostboth is the Director of Ag Development for the South Dakota Department of Agriculture. Representative Mark Mickelson is a member of the South Dakota Legislature representing District 13, Lincoln and Minnehaha counties. Dr. Bob Thaler is an SDSU professor and SDSU Extension swine specialist. Paul Brandt is a farmer from Clear Lake, South Dakota. He is past president of South Dakota Pork Producers and currently serves on the Dual County Zoning Board. Gentlemen, last time we talked about what the state and local governments are doing and what needs to be done in the future to stimulate livestock development and the economic promise that the industry presents for the state. Today we are going to focus on the challenges that lie ahead for livestock producers and government in terms of management, environmental and social implications, and what can be done to overcome those challenges. So let's get started. Paul, these are very important issues. The Department of Agriculture for South Dakota has taken a courageous position on this over the last several years and led a county site analysis program for our state. Please walk through us kind of in detail, Paul, about what that county site analysis includes and how it is working in South Dakota.
Sure. Well, thank you, Dr. Dunn. As we've previously discussed, what we feel is most important in development, and especially livestock development, is proactive planning. There are a lot of considerations for everyone involved when it comes to a new project, not just neighbors, not just state leaders, not just regulators, county commissioners, but the developers themselves. You know, our operators of livestock facilities are making a very significant investment, long-term investment, and they recognize that being good stewards of the land and very respectful of the environment is key for them to operate. They're very much regulated through DNR, Department of Environment and Natural Resources, and they know that if they don't take care of the environment, that it could shut down their facility. They also recognize that it's paramount that they're a good neighbor in terms of trying to mitigate any nuisances, odor, dust, any of those types of things that are legitimate and understandable concerns of neighbors, because they have to rely on most of those same neighbors to provide the feed for their facilities and also the nutrient management acres that they need to be able to operate. So with all of that in mind and all of the considerations that go along with new facilities or the expansion of facilities and all of the stakeholders involved, excuse me, the county site analysis program was designed to try to stem the conversation about these facilities well in advance of a permit, as we've previously discussed. So what we put together in the program is first we go out and we offer to the counties, county commissions. We don't go in and do this work unless we're invited to do so, because this is in support of and for local control. And once invited to come in, we apply certain criteria, kind of somewhat of a standardized program the best we can, that applies local zoning as far as setbacks from residences and municipalities. We look at the road network, proximity to county and state highways. We look at water infrastructure as far as rural water systems. We look at three-phase power. We look at aquifer data from both the standpoint of water availability and also water protection to make sure that we don't put any of our waters at risk from the siting of a development or of a project. So all of those criteria, we go through the planning districts. They use GIS systems, and they essentially create layers, just one layer on top of another for the criteria until the ultimate report is created of sites that are identified. That then is provided to the county strictly as a tool, and the county residents, potential developers, everyone involved, the stakeholders as mentioned, to use as a simple guide, kind of a starting point of where are we at today as we try to plan out what makes sense where and have the discussions of what are the challenges. We allow in the study up to a mile of township road. Any sites outside of that for this initial look we throw out. Doesn't mean there aren't good sites at 1.25 miles off of a township or a county road or 2 miles, but for the sake of trying to find what appears to be the best sites, the best locations with the least amount of challenges is what we shoot for. From there, we can work through what would be challenges of a potential project. That is something we recognize you can't do in days or even a week or two leading up to a permit hearing. This literally takes months to do. So the site analysis program was designed to start those conversations as far as in advance as possible, as I've mentioned, so that we can try to work through those things well before any project or especially a permit hearing.
Yeah, well, thank you, Paul. Paul Brandt, you serve on a local zoning board in Dual County. How does it work from your perspective, Paul?
Well, and I got a comment. I think it's a great program. And one of the things that it's important to mention is these are not pre-approved sites for development. All they are doing is coming into the county and identifying existing sites that meet all those criteria. They came to our county commissioners in conjunction with just an observation from the zoning board, and they met and said, this is kind of the plan, this is what we want to do, and our commissioners discussed that and said, yeah, I think it's important for economic development that if we have sites to build and we have producers that want to either cooperate with in selling those sites or being a part of that group that wants to come in and expand, hey, it's a great opportunity. So I just want to comment on that. I think it's a good program. It doesn't guarantee that that site's going to be approved, but all it does is identify good existing sites that can allow for CAFO development.
Bob, as you watch this process unfold, how's it working across the state? We know there's quite a bit of concern up in some of the counties in the northeastern part of our state, some in the southeast. There's kind of a mixed bag across the state, but some counties have embraced this a great deal. How does it look from your perspective?
You know, I think the counties that embrace it and that have strong county commissioners, strong zoning boards, it really helps, because what we're doing based on science, we're saying here's the areas that meet the criteria. When they tie in the DENR's nutrient management plan, here's how we do it so we responsibly use the manure. If they use the South Dakota odor footprint that was developed at SDSU, then they can say, okay, here's the type of odor levels we're going to have, here's going to be the occurrences. So really then, hopefully it'll take the emotion out of a lot of those discussions, because that's where the issue comes into, separating the decision based on emotion versus science. And what we hope to do is to provide the county commissioners, the zoning boards, the science-based data so they can make informed decisions.
Paul, does the science work? Have we lost some credibility with people when we talk about unbiased science, or do people trust us?
You know, I think it varies, Dean Dunn. You know, a lot of it comes down to when we're having the talks about it. Going back to, again, if we're trying to have the conversations early on outside of a permit hearing, it's a lot easier to take our time. It's a no pressure type of situation at that time where you don't have local leaders that are being asked to make a decision on the spot at a hearing. So we can take the time and walk through and educate anybody that's interested on how does the science work, what does it mean, what does it do, what does it not do. We found that to be the key in trying to get people to really look at what's out there for the science and the technology. And I would quickly add to what these two gentlemen said in regards to sites and why we say that the program is 5% about the sites, maybe 10. It's because it's not predetermining what will be built where. That is strictly a local control thing. We as the state don't want to come in and try to suggest that we know what setbacks should be or what projects should be somewhere. And frankly, those sites don't exist no matter what the GIS data shows, unless and until there's a landowner that says they're interested in developing their site or making it available for development. So it's strictly a starting point so that we can talk about all of the things that have been mentioned, and it's truly nothing more than that.
Representative Mickelson, you courageously took a proactive stand to help this state move forward on these issues. What's next? What are the next challenges at the state level that we need to be thinking of and concerned with as we move this discussion across the state?
Well, we've been having some meetings with the agriculture industry, those that are interested in making sure that this is an available opportunity for the next generation of the family farmer, as long as it's done in a safe manner with local control. And I think it's important when a local zoning decision comes forward, or the group thinks it's important that that it be well established what the county's position is with respect to this kinds of development. And if they are pro-growth, then they follow the law and whatever local ordinance that they've adopted. And currently there is an ability to appeal on a repeat basis. And so there's been some discussion around saying, well, it's important that appeals be heard, but maybe we ought to have a consolidation of all the objections into one round of appeals so that we don't have to come back and forth and make sure that both sides are heard as part of our heritage, but then we move forward. And that's a friendly, that's a pro-business, that's a pro-South Dakota type of legislation in my viewpoint. Some of the folks that are naturally opposed to this kind of development for what I think are just basic philosophical differences about the way farming used to occur may not like that, but I think there will be support for legislation like that. And we've looked, we being this group, we've looked at how do they do this in other places, and there are more family farms in Sioux County, Iowa, and they're family farms than there are in any 4 counties in our state. And so there's cost to us being very slow to adopt what's happened in the world in the last 30 years, 40 years. And the cost is depopulation and a lower price on corn, less of a tax base, and it strains our rural infrastructure. And I think we all agree that, really one of the proudest heritages we have in South Dakota is the strong rural heritage where almost all of us came from, our family ancestry. And so we need to keep having the conversation around the benefits of doing this in a safe manner, and we need to keep the momentum going. Minnesota and Iowa do things very differently. We think we're the business-friendly state. In this area, we're not. They have a well-understood process with certainty, and that encourages development. Sometimes it's more highly regulated, but at least they know what the ground rules are, and it happens. Nebraska, they had a bill last session that set up a list of criteria for animal feeding operations, permitting large animal feeding operations on a permissive basis, so that a county could opt into that set of criteria should they so choose. That's been in the discussion phase. We'll see what the legislative session brings. We're going to have a meeting here later this week and kick some of this stuff around with what I deem to be kind of the experts that Paul and some of his colleagues that are out there next to the front lines on this.
Dr. Thaler, you've seen this livestock issue from a number of perspectives. One of the concerns is about the animal health issues that emerged over the last several years in confined animal feeding. Are the animals healthy in these facilities, and what do producers do to monitor health and the well-being of the animals?
I think if you look at it from a production standpoint, which would be a reflection of health status, in the last 50 years for pork, the productivity has increased 59%. And when you look at the operations, I mean, part of the problem that we have with livestock operations is we try to keep our livestock healthy with high biosecurity, which means we try to keep other people from coming into our farms and bringing in a disease. So when it's hard for outside people to come in farms, they may think we're trying to hide something, but really what we're trying to do is prevent a disease from coming in. For example, the #1 swine disease in the world is PRRS. If that were to come in and hit a swine operation, that would literally be a $1 million loss. And so that would be tough for any business to handle. If you look at our livestock operations today, almost all of them have a consulting veterinarian or work very, very closely with an animal health professional. So I think from a health standpoint, they're healthier than they've ever been. They're in a better environment than they've ever been in their lives. And going back to what Paul said earlier, not only is the housing great for the livestock, but also for the people that work in those barns. And that's one thing that we tend to forget, is that the people that work in those barns are often in really good conditions.
You know, Paul, the state has been taken again, like as Representative Mickelson did himself. The Department of Agriculture has taken a pretty courageous step, a new step in this, led by Secretary Bones and now Secretary Lucas Lynch. What's been the feedback from the state as you've moved forward relatively aggressively to get this discussion going?
You know, I would say at the local level, Dr. Dunn, it's been very well received, as I would say would be reflected in the fact that we have 49 counties that have signed up for the county site analysis program. You know, we go into to them and have the same discussion we are about trying to do the proactive planning. It's not about us telling them what their zoning should be. In the study, we apply their zoning. We don't make any changes to it. We look at their setbacks, and that varies from county to county. And it's been very well received. And you know, even with folks where we sometimes agree to disagree, the opportunity to be involved with the development process is good for everybody. It's the opportunity to learn and not feel like something's being pushed on you or maybe being done behind the scenes, which is a lot of times the case, and which leads to that much more concern. You know, as was just mentioned, if you can't get into the building, well, does that mean they have something to hide? Well, if you've been working on a site for 3 months trying to make sure it works for your facility, and I just learn about it when you go make your request to be on the agenda at the commission level, maybe a week before, well, then that suggests to me you have something to hide in a lot of cases. So the approach has definitely, I would say, been well received, and it's allowed us to have the types of conversations we're having here today on trying to learn together what fits, what works, and what works best.
Yeah. Paul Brandt, USDA's Natural Resource Conservation Service is in every county in the state and provided conservation assistance in the development and design of facilities. Have you or other people in your community been able to take advantage of those additional resources that are out there for livestock producers? In
some instances, producers that have come with CAFO exceptions to the zoning board have used NRCS to build earth containment structures for the smaller feedlots, and that works well. You know, the ability to expand in agriculture is important, in livestock development is important in the community. You know, I always talk about, you know, when somebody asks, what's your farm look like? Well, I say, I farm with a brother, and we raise cattle and hogs and beans and corn and kids. You know, and one of the things that's important, I think, about that statement is, it'd be great to be able to find a place for those kids to come back into the farming operation. And we've talked about, you know, when we built a finisher barn several years ago, the dollars we put into that finisher barn, it was like adding another quarter section to a whole section of land. It became another little factory on that on that section of land. And so when that's paid for, when you do the chores in the barn and you do your work, you make the payments, it provides another enterprise to the operation. And those are the kinds of things we need to allow young people to come back into an established farming operation who may be landlocked as far as trying to find more land to rent. And so we think it's important that we continue to move towards the direction of trying to allow young kids the opportunity to come back onto the farm. I had 4 kids, Lisa and I do, and 3 of them are down here at SDSU. So if there's something going on with SDSU, we probably got our little name on the corner because we're providing some anyway. But I'd love for the opportunity of those 4 kids all to come back into our operation. And livestock's a young person's business at times, you know. It's labor intensive at times, you know, but you got to be able to provide opportunity for those kids to come back. There's other things besides just the zoning, you know. There's capital. We look at those, and that's a whole other issue. But one of the things that we found, and this has not only happened in our business, in the hog business, but in livestock cattle feeding businesses as well. And there's an example of a young person in our county several years ago came to the zoning board, stood before the zoning board, 22, 23 years old. I was so proud of that kid, you know. He came there and presented what he wanted to do. He wanted to build a feedlot. And so he now has a couple feedlots with the capital. And I'm not just sure how his operation works, but this can be a template for others. You don't necessarily have to own the pigs in the barn or the cattle in the barn. It reduces your risk, your capital risk, if you don't have the production and marketing risk. If all you're responsible for, like in our operation with custom feeding pigs, if all you're responsible for is to make sure that those pigs are taken care of every day and let the owner of the livestock handle the production risk and the cattle, we know that there will be a payment at the end of the day. We'll be paid, we'll be compensated fairly well for the hours we spend in the barn. When the barn's paid for, that becomes a pretty nice source of income, just like when you'd have a piece of land paid for. So,
Dr. Thaler, help us understand how a livestock operation, whether it be whatever size it is, large or small, or a dairy or a swine operation or a poultry operation or cattle, how does that impact the value of the grain in the local area? As Representative Mickelson said, we've had an 800 million bushel corn crop last year. We're certainly going to a 1 billion bushel corn crop in South Dakota over the next few years. How does livestock, walk us through how livestock really does impact, I know the price of corn. We hear about basis and things like that. What is that, Bob?
Just to give you an example, I checked prices out this morning, and the difference between Sioux Center, Iowa and Mitchell, South Dakota on Friday, corn was 16 cents a bushel cheaper in Mitchell. Soybeans were 45 cents a bushel cheaper in Mitchell than Sioux Center, and that's only 135 miles away.
Why? Why is that price difference there?
And I think that goes back to Representative Mickelson's comment. Sioux County is the #1 livestock county in the country, and so they're a net importer, not an exporter of corn. They need livestock. They need grains to go into the livestock feed. If you look at it, livestock is the original value added to our corn and soybeans and grains. The other thing that we tend to forget too is manure has a value. Paul was talking about a 2,400 head finishing barn. That manure is worth $200 an acre, which would mean an additional $72,000 a year to that operation. And the question that I always have, we all want sustainable livestock production, okay? So what's more sustainable? Taking our locally raised corn and soybeans, feeding it to livestock, capturing that manure, applying it at agronomic rates back to our crops, and having a sustainable circle, or bringing in urea, which is made from petroleum products from somewhere else in the world. So I think when we really talk about sustainable livestock, it's got to be a combination of livestock with our grain farmers working together.
Paul?
Just a comment on that. Man, South Dakota is a wonderful state to raise livestock in. We have access to cheap feed. We're fairly close to, on a pork produce side and on a cattle side, to a lot of livestock markets. And we have a lot of open space. You know, we want to try to put livestock development in areas where there's not a lot of livestock development right now. For people that raise livestock in Iowa and Minnesota, right next to their neighbors, the biosecurity issues are more important. They would love to have the ability to expand, you know, several miles away from the nearest hog or the nearest other dairy. And this state is just wonderful. We don't have a problem building a huge marketing or a collection facility to buy grain and ship it out on a railroad. Nobody has a problem building those kinds of things, and yet we're taking that product and shipping it out of the state. We don't see anybody complain about when somebody wants to build a big grain bin site. You know, there's no opposition. But when we want to build a factory to use the corn and the beans in our state, that's when we have the problem. So there's a little bit of a disconnect between, you know, what is true economic development? Is it building that receiving plant so it can put it on the railroad and send it out of the state? Or is it building a concentrated animal feeding operation or a livestock facility, a dairy, a hog barn in our state that can take that grain?
I can underscore the point about us having a cost advantage. Paul and Bob mentioned, we are a residual grain state, and we're as far from a destination market as you can get if you don't have a local market. Ethanol took care of corn, you know, but 10 years ago, now corn's going to 1 billion bushels. What makes us cost competitive is we have a lot of grain and we're a long way from market. And so the jobs associated with this and the return on the investment are good. The cost advantage is a natural investment. It's not tied to a low-wage job. I think that's important that people understand that our basic natural resource of grain is sold cheap because of transportation costs. If we want to change that, we need to consume it locally.
Representative Mickelson, there are a group of people in South Dakota who've really led the state in livestock development and maintaining their cultural lifestyle and bringing their children back into the operation. Talk to us about what you've seen from the Hutterite communities in South Dakota and how they've made this work.
Well, as we got into as I began learning more about this issue, I was surprised the concentration of what I'll call modern animal agriculture that takes place in the Hutterite communities. 60 to 65% of the hogs that are produced in this state come from the colonies, and every turkey, you know, that every member of the turkey plant in Huron is a Hutterite colony, and there isn't a turkey producer in South Dakota that's not Hutterite, and it's not that way in Minnesota and Iowa. I don't know, I can't tell you why, but they have been certainly leaders in proving that this can be done economically. It can benefit their community, very much so, and it can be done in an environmentally safe manner. They've certainly taken the long view on agriculture, and probably the collective nature of their life has given them some advantages on capital, but I do think this is an area where the rest of agriculture in South Dakota can watch and maybe start to emulate some of their practices and help push everything forward.
Just to make it clear, Paul, a colony, if they built a livestock operation, they would be under the same exact regulations as anyone in South Dakota. Isn't that correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, their facilities would be treated the same oversight from DNR and any other regulatory agency would be treated the same. That's correct.
I think that was kind of interesting. Paul Brandt and my friend John Whiff from Oak Lane Colony, about 3 weeks ago, they had an open house for basically a 10,000 head finishing barn, and incredible technology in there. But the one thing that John said that really struck me, he said, you know, we didn't build this for our children, we built it for our grandchildren. And so that was pretty cool. And again, as you said, Dean Dunn, they're taking the long-term view of it, and that's helping their communities and their way of living survive.
Well, that's all we have time for this episode of Contours. I'd like to thank Paul Kostboth, Representative Mark Mickelson, Dr. Bob Thaler, and our good friend Paul Brandt for their input. What's being done to maintain and improve the health of South Dakota's soils? We'll find out next time when soil health is our discussion topic for the next edition of Contours. We hope you will join us then, and thanks for watching.
Contours is a conversation about issues in agriculture that impact us all. These programs are produced by the South Dakota State University College of Agriculture and Biological Sciences and SDSU Extension. You can watch these programs on your local South Dakota Public Broadcasting station or by going online to igrow.org.